All right, everybody, welcome to this week's edition of the Dissident Film Club, which was recorded 2 days ago by the time you saw it, because by the time anyone's watching this, Russell will be in northern India. So good luck, Russell. I hope you're feeling fine at the time people view this, but Russell's going to be on his way tomorrow, Thursday. By the time you guys see this, it's Friday. But by the time this airs, it will be February 10th, just 4 days away from Valentine's Day. And we thought we would put together our top 10 dissident love story films. So it's really going to be each of our top 5 films. We didn't curate a definitive top 10. I'm going to count down my top 5 as Russell counts down his.
Okay, so let me just be clear before we get into this. This is a personal list. If I were going to have to defend my thesis for a film criticism degree, this would probably not be my list. Also, these are intentionally kind of offbeat. You know, we've seen Casablanca, like, sure.
Well, that's what we mean by dissident. I mean? We don't necessarily even mean politically dissident. We mean love stories, romance movies that buck the trends. Right, exactly.
Yes, not normal. But in terms of my top 5, I made it in accordance with the spirit of love. This is a deeply personal top 5. Okay, so number 5, Secretary, with Raymond Reddington beating the shit out of Maggie Gyllenhaal for most of the movie. Really, it doesn't get that rough. This was really like an early kink positive movie. Although today, it would be interesting to screen this with the wokest person you might be dating, to watch their head explode between the competing imperatives of being kink positive and the post-Me Too era. Because this is a movie in which Maggie Gyllenhaal, who is a disturbed, troubled young woman who's been released from a psychiatric institution, takes a job as James Spader's secretary. And they kind of have complementary psychological problems, and it isn't very long before he is spanking her for her typos, and she's falling in love with him for administering these spankings. It was a very controversial movie when it came out. Now, you very rarely hear anyone talk about Secretary, I think because no one knows what to do with it for that reason. Because on the one hand, it's a trailblazing film in kink positivity. And I would argue, unlike 50 Shades of Grey, really deals with the psychology of people who are attracted to this lifestyle. What kinds of psychological quirks people might have that would attract them to that lifestyle. I feel like that movie gave me more insight into that than anything else I've ever been exposed to. But I think in the Me Too era, the idea of a boss calling his secretary in, ordering her to bend over the table and administering spanking, I think people just don't know what to do with that. So they just stop talking about it.
I think you're right. And, you know, it's also sort of its own sort of satire on workplace dynamics also, at the same time of being this exploration of kink, right, as romance, right, sort of abuse as therapy kind of thing. Yes, definitely a cool movie. Definitely one of a kind, a movie that's very unlikely to be made again. Anything of its kind will be made again anytime soon. So one from the time capsule there. My number 5 is a very, very dark film called Blue Valentine. This is a Valentine's themed show. This was from 2010, directed by Derek Cianfrance, and starring the great Michelle Williams and Ryan Gosling, who are two of the cream of the crop in terms of actors of their generation. This came out in 2010. This movie was actually written in 2002, and because of its very unflinching approach to very dark and bleak and controversial subject matter, didn't have the funding to get off the ground until 2008, 2009. That was, of course, when Heath Ledger tragically passed away, Michelle Williams obviously had kids with Heath Ledger, and so while the movie was set to be shot in California, they then had to raise a bunch more money to shoot it in New York because she wanted to be close to his kids, obviously, which were her kids as well. So it was a very, very tumultuous process getting this movie made. Part of the reason it took so long to fund this project is because of its very direct approach to controversial issues, most specifically in this case, the abortion issue. The movie is very simply and straightforwardly, in fact, one critic wrote, it's about an abortion that didn't happen but should have. You have these two main characters sort of fall in love, they get pregnant, and there's this really, really traumatic scene where she's about to have the baby terminated and literally in the office decides she can't go through with it. And then he says, don't worry, we'll be able to raise this kid. And they find out that the decision to try and attempt a family without really knowing each other very well just sort of undoes each of them in their own way. It's very bleak. It's very tragic. And like I said, there are few movies that deal with that issue as directly as this one. We talked about Rosemary's Baby on our sort of horror countdown list. This is one more that just takes a very unflinching attitude towards very, very dark and controversial topics, but it is extremely well made. Like I said, the acting is just absolutely first rate. The script is fantastic. Visually, it's wonderful. And so if you have the stomach for it, I would recommend Blue Valentine.
Well, and when it first came out, it had a Russell Stover sponsorship, didn't it? Wasn't that part of the marketing for it? It was Russell Stover chocolates and Blue Valentine.
Yeah, it's got Valentine right in the title.
It's got Valentine in it.
Actually, my title for that movie would have been, I think Blue Valentine was a missed opportunity. They go to this sort of like, I forget what it was because I saw it a long time ago, but it's like this, almost like this like romance house for couples to like go on adventures and stuff. And there's all kinds of themed rooms. And one of the rooms that they go in is called the Future Room. And I thought the Future Room would have been a great title for that movie because it's about it's about two young people in love who just, because they're so in love, they misjudge what the future has in store for them if they make certain choices. So that would have been great. So poorly titled, but a great film nonetheless.
Okay, so my number 4 is True Romance, written by Quentin Tarantino, directed by Tony Scott, Ridley Scott's younger brother, who tragically committed suicide in 2012. I would argue this was his only really worthwhile movie. In spite of our rather positive review of Maverick, I am not a Top Gun fan, which he directed. He was a successful director, but his films were pretty superficial. This, he did a great job. Of course, he's helped by Quentin Tarantino in his prime, having written the screenplay. This is Clarence, a Elvis fan and kung fu movie fanatic, very much like Tarantino himself. Tarantino has actually said this is his most personal autobiographical screenplay. Meets a prostitute who has similar kung fu movie fixations at a festival, and they strike up a romance. He decides to extricate her from her pimp, one of the best roles Gary Oldman has ever taken on.
Absolutely.
The scene, he basically steals the movie in the 5-minute scene that he has in this.
Plays a Rastafarian pimp. Yep.
He plays, like he wouldn't even be allowed to do this today.
Right.
Like they wouldn't even let him do this role. He really was brilliantly inventive. I mean, he's somebody else who was in his prime. That was Gary Oldman at the height of his powers. So I have quotes for all these movies. I would say this is my favorite quote, and it's from that movie, and it's from that scene where Gary Oldman's character talks about how he's not looking at him, so he must be intimidated. And Clarence comes back with, "I'm not eating because I'm not hungry. I'm not sitting because I'm not staying. I'm not looking at the movie because I saw it 7 years ago. It's the Mac with Max Julian, Carol Speed, and Richard Pryor. I'm not scared of you. I just don't like you. In that envelope is some payoff money. Alabama's moving on to some greener pastures. We're not negotiating. I don't like to barter. I don't like to dicker. I never have fun in Tijuana. That price is non-negotiable. What's in that envelope is for my peace of mind. My peace of mind is worth that much, not 1 penny more. Not 1 penny more. Ooh, you can feel, even today, you can feel. That was Tarantino really at his best at that time. Christian Slater does a great job with it. And it's definitely in keeping what we were talking about with Maverick, although this for a very different reason. We do not make movies like this anymore. We do not write characters like this anymore. We do not have male heroes like this anymore. It was a very interesting, as most of Tarantino's stuff in this period was. It was this very Gen X interpretation of the tough action hero.
Yeah, no, True Romance is absolutely extraordinary. This would have certainly been on my list if it weren't on yours. We wanted to do 10 different ones, so I gave it to you. But no, it's one of my favorite movies ever. The cast is just off the hook from top to bottom. You mentioned Kristen Slater, Patricia Arquette is great in this. Gary Oldman. You also had Christopher Walken, Dennis Hopper, and James Gandolfini. This movie, for my money, has the single best fight scene I've ever seen in a movie, which is Arquette versus James Gandolfini. That scene in her room, in her apartment, is just so brutal, but so cathartic in the end. Not to spoil it, it's such an amazingly brutal and just visceral fight scene. Yeah, it's fantastic. And fun fact, Tarantino actually wrote a much sadder ending for this movie, and it was Tony Scott who said, "Listen, Quentin, I know you may be precious about this ending, but we can't do it." He just said, the audience is going to love these two characters too much to do what you want to do at the end. They will never forgive us if we end it the way you want. And that adds to the romance of the movie. He was right, because the movie is a fairy tale of sorts, and it's absolutely amazing. So yes, True Romance, phenomenal pick. No doubt about that. All right. My number 4 is a quirky little film by one of my favorite quirky little filmmakers, Wes Anderson. This is called Moonrise Kingdom. This came out in 2012. Now, obviously, this isn't even my favorite of Wes Anderson's films, but it's one that really qualifies as a dissident love story. This feels like Wes Anderson's most personal movie ever, because he's so meticulous and his movies always almost play like animated dollhouse, stories. It's tough to really get a glimpse into who he is, but this movie you really feel is his most personal film. It's about these two young child lovers who basically fall in love, and they say, we're going to elope and just run away as lovers from this sort of fictitious island called the Isle of Penzance, this fictitious New England island in 1965, when there's a lot of tumult happening around the world, and they're living in, as you can see from the photo, this very closed off, sort of pristine pastoral place where they're not supposed to experience certain feelings and certain desires yet, but they feel them, and they decide to act on them in defiance of the adults. So it's very much a story of generational rebellion. They're real rebels in that sense. They are dissidents, you might say. And they're absolutely fantastic in the role, Jared Gilman and Kara Hayward. And it's handled with this great charm, this great innocence, this great humor. And the supporting cast, obviously fantastic. Wes Anderson always seems to find great actors for roles big and small. Ed Norton, Frances McDormand, Bill Murray, Tilda Swinton, Bob Balaban, Harvey Keitel. Just a great cast. It's a lean, mean 90-minute runtime, so it's an easy sit, and really, really charming, really, really funny, and has a big heart. And definitely you get a glimpse into the sort of anarchist spirit of Wes Anderson. So this is one of my favorites of his, and certainly the most rebellious of his sort of love story films. Even more so than Rushmore, I would argue.
All right, number 3. Now we're getting into my shit. Now we're really getting into my shit. Wild at Heart, Nicolas Cage, Laura Dern. This was David Lynch also at the peak of his powers and at the height of his commercial success. This is that period where David Lynch managed to transition from the guy who made these art house movies like Eraserhead to being, for a minute, the hottest director in Hollywood. This is after not Twin Peaks, after Blue Velvet.
Blue Velvet, yeah.
Became this unlikely hit. And he basically then invented prestige TV. with Twin Peaks. Wild at Heart was the follow-up to Blue Velvet, and it was much anticipated. It did not do great at the box office. It won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, which was very controversial. Some people booed it. I loved it. I still do. It's adopted from a novel. Nicolas Cage plays Sailor, a guy from the rough side of the tracks who has caught the passionate, deep, fiery love of Laura Dern's character Lula, who's from a kind of aristocratic, old money New Orleans family. So she runs off with Sailor, and her mother, played by Diane Ladd, who actually got a Best Supporting Actress nomination for this, sends local hitmen to go kill Sailor. Lynch, being Lynch, ties in a kind of weird Wizard of Oz running theme where it's kind of the matrix of coincidence. People keep referencing the Wizard of Oz randomly throughout it. But the line I pulled out, although there are a lot of great lines in this is a snakeskin jacket. And for me, it's a symbol of my individuality and my belief in personal freedom. That was one of my favorite lines from that movie, along with, one day Dell will realize that the aliens with black rubber gloves were him. As I said, very David Lynch before he disappeared up his own ass. This is when he was right in that sweet spot where he's doing this magic realism, but he hasn't just abandoned the idea of needing to communicate to his audience. Now, he himself said the movie is about finding love in hell. And although I find the movie funny and affecting, there are some really disturbing scenes here that evoke that. There is this kind of, it's that very David Lynch dark underbelly of America, of motels with dried vomit on the 50-year-old carpet, threadbare carpeting. It's mad people on the sides of highways with ill intent. It's very much that world. And these two people who are deeply, passionately, and I might also add, very sexually in love. I can't think of another movie that was quite so comfortable with the erotic dimension of the love story as Wild at Heart is. That's very, very central to it, but at the same time doesn't take anything away from the depth of their feelings for each other. David Lynch at his best. I don't think he ever did anything. Maybe he's done some things that might have gelled a little bit better, but I don't think he ever made a better film.
All right, my number 3 is a tiny little film that opened at the Sundance Film Festival and then later premiered on Valentine's Day, oddly enough, of that year, and it's called All the Real Girls. This is a movie starring Zooey Deschanel in her first real lead role, so this was very much a breakout role for her. Even though the movie didn't get seen by many people, this definitely got her noticed in a big way as a lead actor who could carry a feature film. It's directed by David Gordon Green, who is now doing these horror remakes. He did the Halloween trilogy remake just now. He's doing The Exorcist, which is coming out, I think, later this year. Before this, he did the stoner comedies like Pineapple Express and a few others of that kind. But before that, his first 4 films were all these micro-budget indie films, and they were all fantastic, and none of them made a dime. So I understand why he had to switch. He had to sell out a little bit because he had to, keep the money coming in, I suppose. But this is a great little movie. This just takes place in a sort of rural sort of plant town in North Carolina, which is where he is from himself, David Gordon Green. And it's a love story, a very genuine, sincere sort of coming-of-age love story between the town playboy who's basically slept with every woman in the town because it's this tiny little southern rural town. He falls in love with his best friend's younger sister, who is a version, right? She lives this very sheltered life. And so it's just this very earnest, very sweet, just very maturely told, just adult love story. And the thing that makes this different as a film is that it's one of the only films that addresses these kinds of just rural southern blue collar people as just ordinary people. There's no pretense to the setting, right? A lot of these like mature dramatic love stories take place in these very like cosmopolitan settings, right? Whether, you know, it's like a Noah Baumbach movie or even like Woody Allen. Most of his movies are for laughs, but he's written a handful of serious films himself. You know, they take place in New York and Los Angeles and London. This is just a very mature adult, well-written, well-told, very simple love story that takes place in a part of the country where people are not taken as seriously as this. It doesn't, you know, these sorts of characters are not often treated with the sort of respect that this movie treats them with. And so I love that about this. It's very unusual in that way. The other thing I love about this movie is it's very confident in its simplicity. It is about one thing. It is about a young couple finding love in each other despite their very different personal backgrounds. It never feels a need to be more than that. It you know, it doesn't go into any crazy sort of escalations. There's no murders, there's no, you know, disappearances, there's no mysteries. It just is what it is. And it's very simple and it's very sort of confident in itself. The acting is fantastic. I think the writing is great. It's very, very well shot. So this did win awards at Sundance and then opened on Valentine's Day, but it's a really, really sweet movie. And like I said, it treats these sort of deplorables, if you will, with more respect than you'll see in almost any other, certainly any other like big Hollywood film. So very much recommend that one.
Okay. All right. So now I'm really going off the beaten track. Number 2 from 1979. Love at First Bite. This is a movie that I have loved pretty much as long as I've been alive. In fact, I wouldn't even recommend it if I hadn't seen it in the last couple of years. And it's actually funnier now in a lot of ways. So Dracula, because at this time, 1979, Transylvania is within the Eastern Bloc countries. The Communist Party comes to evict him from his castle in order to turn it into a gymnastics training center. He is obsessed with a fashion model who he believes is the reincarnation of his lost love, Mina Harker. So he goes to the New York City of the 1970s. One of the funniest scenes in this movie is they accidentally deliver his coffin to a funeral at a black church in Harlem. And in the middle of Sherman Hemsley delivering the eulogy, he wakes up. This is not the lobby of the Plaza Hotel. still kills. Richard Benjamin is in this movie. He was in a lot of things back then. He is the grandson of Von Helsing. He is converted to Judaism because he's a psychiatrist. So for professional reasons, he's become Jewish. And he is the fiance of Dracula's love interest. Probably the standout line in that movie because his love interest is very 70s New York, free love, promiscuity. So she asked Dracula to stay for a quickie, and he responds, "With you, never a quickie, always a longie." The only thing that will be missing from this movie, if you see it, and it still bothers me, is there is a disco scene that originally had the disco classic "I Love the Nightlife." And when they went over to VHS and streaming, they didn't have the rights to it. So they had to stick in some shitty song, and they still have the scene, but they put in a different song and it doesn't work. Like they're clearly not dancing to this song. But other than that, it's definitely a time capsule. It's that 1970s New York with a lot of jokes about crime and drugs and promiscuity and discos and that kind of thing. But it is still a very funny clever, well executed movie.
Interesting. Yeah, this is the only one on your list that I have not actually seen. I have not seen Love at First Bite. So
I would highly recommend it. It is still a really, really clever screenplay.
all righty. Well, my number 2 is Brokeback Mountain. And this is, for what it is, a flawlessly made film. And the reason I picked this is because, well, number one, like as I just said, for what it is, the movie is just flawlessly done. The writing, the directing, the acting, the cinematography in this movie is impeccable. Should have won the Oscar for that. You could pause this movie at just about any point and you have a perfectly framed portrait. You know, it takes place in like the mountains of Wyoming, so the locales are just gorgeous. And the way it was captured on film is just fantastic. The music, everything comes together so perfectly, which is why it went on this massive awards run leading up to the Oscars. And then at the Oscars, liberal woke Hollywood, who we rip on a lot on this show, and that's one of the reasons why I picked this for this segment here. Woke Hollywood decided in 2005, 1 year after George W. Bush won re-election trashing gay marriage, that they couldn't actually go through with awarding Best Picture to a gay film. And so instead, they got cold feet and they gave it to Crash, this horribly ham-handed, melodramatic, just on-the-nose, preachy, nonsense sort of race relations movie. And this movie lost a lot of its cachet after losing that Oscar race, but it absolutely deserved to win. And, you know, this is one of the things that we mention all the time on this show. You know, we may reject the excesses of woke discourse, but on a policy level, we're actually more woke than a lot of these people are, and certainly more woke than they were. The fact that we get to hear these lectures from these people all the time now, especially about the LGBT issues and stuff like that, these same people, when they thought it was going to cost Hollywood money, because that's what they were really afraid of, can we give this film Best Picture, or is that going to create too much anti-Hollywood backlash from the country, which had just rejected gay marriage the year prior? This movie came out in 2005. They said, no, we can't go there. And so this is really an example, like I said, of just that hypocrisy in action. But the movie itself, I know it's somewhat of a punchline now with the I can't quit you and stuff like that, and that's all fine. But it's really a flawlessly made film. It's a beautifully, beautifully made film in just about every way. In terms of putting a movie together, you really can't do a better job than this. Directed by Ang Lee, who did win the Oscar for this. Just an extraordinary filmmaker. This is one of his best films. There were a few Ang Lee films that I could have chosen to put on this list, actually. That's how good he is. But this just kind of had to be there.
Did you ever see College Humor did a parody of that?
I mean, I'm sure I did. It was a while ago, but I'm sure I did. There were a lot of parodies.
It was two women, and their big problem was everyone was encouraging them and wanted to watch.
Right, yeah, that was the obstacle that they faced.
Like the husband confronts her, I just don't understand why I can't watch. So anyway, worth looking up. I'm sure that's still on YouTube.
Yeah.
All right. So my number one favorite, and I often say if I were on a desert island and I had to pick a movie, I'd probably pick Joe versus the Volcano. I absolutely love this movie. I think it has an incredible amount of heart, written and directed by John Patrick Shanley. Also, these are all movies that were done by these great artists at the peak of their powers. This is another one where this is right when John Patrick Shanley is really at the peak of his powers. And I think the writing here reflects that. There are just so many great moments. So Tom Hanks works in this just horrible plant, just absolutely, Kafka-esque place. One of the best moments is when his boss is just in the background on the phone saying, I know he can get the job, but can he do the job? I'm not asking you that. I'm not questioning that, but can he do the job? Just under the whole scene is his boss just basically repeating that line of dialogue. I'm not asking you that. I know he can get the job, but can over and over and over and over again. Also, this is the only movie where they ever really let Meg Ryan show her comedy chops. where she didn't just play this ingenue. She plays the secretary at that office, and she plays two sisters, one of which is this very superficial LA type, and the other one that's more grounded and is the one that becomes his love interest. She's great in all three roles. She shows actually a capacity for character work that if you never saw this movie, you would not know she's capable of, because again, they never let her do this in any other movie ever again.
I mean, the fake orgasm scene was something. That's got to count for something.
Was something, but they only let no. I'm not saying within her type. Right, she didn't demonstrate, but they never let her go outside of that.
Right, okay.
They never let her demonstrate she could do anything other than Meg Ryan.
Right.
This is the only movie where you see her do character work, really. And she was great. She's great. She's funny. So the premise is he quits his job, and he is diagnosed by his doctor as having a brain cloud, a disease which has no symptoms, but is going to kill him. Shortly after that, he's approached by a very wealthy industrialist who extracts boobaroo from an island in the South Pacific where the people live in a kind of Polynesian tribal way. And in order for him to get them to agree to give him the boobaroo, they need someone to be sacrificed in the volcano. So offers Joe all the money in the world to do it. And since he's dying anyway, he agrees to do it. My favorite line in this movie, there's another movie that gets stolen by somebody who's not in the movie very long, Ossie Davis. Before Tom Hanks goes to this island, he goes to New York to go on a shopping spree, to go on the town. Ossie Davis is his limousine driver, and Tom Hanks keeps pestering him about what hotel he would stay in and how he would dress and what he would do. So finally, Ossie Davis gets tired of it. He pulls the car over, and this is the monologue that I feel is the greatest monologue in this movie. Clothes make the man. I believe that. You say to me you want to go shopping, you want to buy clothes, but you don't know what kind. You leave that hanging in the air like I'm going to fill in the blank. That to me is like asking me who you are, and I don't know who you are. I don't want to know. It's taken me my whole life to find out who I am, and I'm tired now. You hear what I'm saying? That is a great monologue. Ossie Davis, that scene steals the movie. But this is a movie with a beautiful, beautiful heart. On a more sober, rich moment. Tom Hanks thinks he's going to die, and there's this beautiful moment where he's floating out on these trunks that he's bought, and the moon is above him. And he has this great moment where he says, I forgot how big, and he thanks God for his life. There's just so much going on in that movie. And that is why it would be my Desert Island movie. That's why it's one that I unironically recommend for Valentine's Day.
Yeah, I mean, John Patrick Shanley is a great writer. For those who don't know the name, he's obviously most famous for Moonstruck, which is his Oscar-winning screenplay, but then he's also a great and prolific writer for the stage, won a Pulitzer Prize for the play Doubt. And then he started his career in the 80s writing all these really, really amazing sort of off-Broadway, tiny little plays. Danny and the Deep Blue Sea, great romance in and of itself. The Dreamer Examines His Pillows, another great play of his. He wrote this wonderful little short play called The Red Coat, which is part of a short play series. I forget, what was it, Welcome to the Moon? Something like that. I forget what the name of that short play series was, but a true writer's writer and a real romantic, and just has such poetic mastery of the language, which is why all the stuff he writes is great. I actually found myself as a kid loving the movie Congo, which is the Michael Crichton adaptation with the killer apes and stuff. And everybody hated that movie, but I loved it. And I came to find out later, John Patrick Shanley actually wrote the screenplay for that movie. Because the dialogue is so great.
I didn't know that.
The dialogue is so quick and sharp and funny, and it's in this like commercial kind of ridiculous monster movie, but the scene writing is so good in it, and that's why, because he wrote it. So yeah. And this movie is one of the other kinds of, you mentioned earlier Secretary, even Wild at Heart I would put in this sort of category. It's really one of a kind. There's no movie quite like it, It's a true original in that sense.
Well, that's what really strikes you. Watch it. It feels like a playwright wrote a screenplay because the dialogue is just better. The whole conception is very theatrical with all these characters, and Meg Ryan kind of represents his psychological journey through these different characters she takes on. It's like there's just more going on here than would be going on in a rom-com normally.
Yeah, no, it's definitely good. And like I said, it's a movie that's really not like any other. There's no movie quite like Joe versus the Volcano. All right, my number one is one of my favorite movies ever. From time to time, I call this my favorite movie ever. There's no movie that hits me quite this hard when I watch it. This is the 1998 Italian film by Roberto Benigni, Life is Beautiful. I think this is just an absolutely extraordinary movie. Obviously, if you see at the top of this graphic, the winner of the Grand Jury Prize at the Cannes Film Festival, Benigni won an Oscar for this. He stars in the movie. He also directed the movie himself. This is such a radical film in the sense that it mixes a full-on rom-com with a Holocaust movie. The first hour of this movie is the story of one man courting the woman of his dreams. And Benigni plays his character with a sort of Chaplin-esque charm. It's sincerely funny. It is hysterically funny, and it's incredibly sweet and charming and romantic in the truest sense of the word. Of course, they are living as Jews in Italy in the 40s, and the second half of the movie, his family gets put in one of the camps, and he decides that for the emotional protection of his son, that he is going to act like this concentration camp experience is one big game because he doesn't want his son to get scared. And so he play acts this sort of slapstick comedy routine while in the concentration camp. And he, without spoiling the movie, he commits to that role until the bitter end. And it's just so incredibly moving. It's so miraculous that a movie like this could work, where the first half is a rom-com and the second half is Schindler's List. It's amazing. It's absolutely extraordinary how he pulled this off. This is another movie that, you know, in this era of woke Hollywood, good luck getting a rom-com Holocaust movie greenlit.
I was just thinking, as you described it, like, I would love to have been a fly on the wall for that pitch meeting.
Yeah, right, exactly. There's no way you could ever get this past the pitch meeting nowadays, but it is truly a beautiful film. It is hysterically funny. It is unspeakably tragic. It is incredibly moving. I could not recommend this movie more highly.
I agree with every word you said. It's because I grew up with Italians from the other side who had that kind of sense of humor. When I saw Life is Beautiful, it struck me, oh, so this wasn't that they were crazy bastards. This is cultural. Like, because his sense of humor was very much like the Italians I grew up with.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's slapstick, but it's a particular kind of slapstick that's unique to Italians.
Right. And it's not slapstick substituting for wit. It's both. Like, the dialogue itself is witty, and he adds this physicality to it. Whereas like I said, the first hour is just a beautiful, straight rom-com. You would never guess that they're gonna get taken to a concentration. I mean, there's certain shots where he'll ride his bike past a store and it'll be closed up, and he'll sense, what's going on there? Something's not right, because the owners have obviously been taken away. There's hints at it very subtly, but the movie for the first hour is just this beautifully funny rom-com. And then it takes this turn that you would think, how is this possibly going to work? But it works amazingly.
And then it's still funny.
It's still funny.
Just to still be funny in the concentration camp.
Yeah.
That movie is amazing. And if you look at our list as a whole, this is kind of a running theme as well. And if anything, it demonstrates how much you lose when you create a climate where people are afraid to make a mistake. Because there are so many movies on this list that would never be made now. Right. Because it would just never get past the pitch meeting. People would just be afraid who's going to be offended by it. I mean, True Romance, forget about it. They would never make True Romance. The Christopher Walken, Dennis Hopper scene.
Dennis Hopper scene. That's an amazing scene. But yeah, no, forget it. Never.
No. I mean, at least half of the movies on this list would be deemed too risky now. So, and this is a big part of why there are so few movies of interest now. Because if you can't take that chance, if you can't pitch the Holocaust rom-com, then you don't get Life is Beautiful. You just don't get that. And hey, man, if somebody came and pitched that to me, I would think there's every chance that's going to be a disaster. God bless whoever said, all right, you're a funny guy. I bet you can make it work.
Well, because even though it's funny and remains funny to the end, it also pays ultimate respect to the tragedy and the gravity of the time.
Of course it does.
It takes it's like the Abbott and Costello meets Frankenstein, where it's like when that movie is supposed to be a comedy, it plays as a comedy. But when it's supposed to be scary, it actually has some genuine scares. It's not like the whole thing is one big joke. And so it's the same type of thing there. But yeah, anyway, that is our list. So we will bid you guys farewell. Maybe this is a nice little Netflix and chill playlist for you and your significant other for the next week or so. Maybe you could imbibe on some of these films, and we will see you back next week. Russell, bon voyage.
Thank you. And be careful with this list. Know who you're dating, because some of these could wind up making you single.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the only ones on this list I would argue are pretty safe. Man, looking through, not many. I would say All the Real Girls is really the only one that's probably
Joe versus the Volcano.
And Joe versus the Volcano. Yeah, absolutely.
Love
that's quirky.
Love
it's
at
not
first
for everybody's
bite
taste, but it's not going to offend anybody. Right.
Yeah, Love at First Bite is not offensive.
Exactly.
Pretty much everything else, though, you gotta know your partner.
Exactly. And you should know your partner anyway. Stay safe, right?
Yeah, stay safe out there.
Stay safe out there, you crazy kids. See you next time.